Hey Haley, so you wanted to learn about mythology, at least that's what you told me. That's pretty cool. So here I am. I'm gonna tell you about mythology in podcast form. Huzzah! It's also on a Google document that you're going to get, obviously. So we're gonna start with the story of Ishtar in the underworld, which starts in Mesopotamia, specifically Sumeria, between the Tigris and Euphrates River, which is in modern day Turkey, in case you don't know geography all that well. So there's this goddess in Sumerian mythology called Ishtar, and she's the goddess of love, fertility, and war, which is something a lot more common than you would think. I don't really have time to get into all of it. So Ishtar had a husband named Tammuz. He's associated with agriculture, and he's dead now. She tried to have a rebound romance with this guy named Gilgamesh, but he says no and gives her like an entire list of reasons why he said no. So Ishtar, she's understandably very sad and honestly a little mad at Gilgamesh, but that's a different story. We don't have time to get into that epic right now. Luckily, Ishtar remembers she's a goddess and can just like go to the underworld to see her husband. So she starts to head down to the underworld, but she has to get through 7 gates. And at each gate, she has to remove an item of clothing as payment. It's like strip dying, the ultimate party game. Play it with your friends. Now, why exactly she had to strip to get to the underworld isn't exactly clear. Some scholars say it's symbolic of her stripping off her power to show she isn't going to try to conquer the underworld. I think the Sumerians just want an excuse to draw their sex goddess naked. By the time she gets to Ereshkigal, who's the queen of the underworld, she's like fully naked and probably a little upset. Probably related to the fact that she's completely naked to get to the underworld to see her husband. Sadly for Ishtar, her day doesn't get any better because Ereshkigal informs her that she can't even see her husband because the underworld is for dead people and she's alive. So, upon learning that she can't see her husband, she tries to leave. Lesson number 1 of the underworld is that it's a lot easier to get in than it is to get out. So, Ereshkigal unleashes 60 diseases on Ishtar and traps her in her palace. Another god, this one's named Ea. He's a big, smart ocean god who is on occasion also called Enki. He finds out Ishtar is trapped in the underworld, and because Ishtar is the goddess of fertility, without her, nothing fertile is happening on Earth. So no babies are born, and this is a bad thing, apparently. So he makes this generally ambiguous guy named Asushinami. It's very unclear whether Asushinami is supposed to be intersex, androgynous, or non-binary, mainly because the Mesopotamians didn't have words for any of those things. Regardless, they are referred to as neither man nor woman, and most translators refer to them as they. So that's pretty cool. Asushinami pops down to the underworld. They don't have to strip, probably because they aren't a woman and thus fewer Sumerians wanted to draw them naked. Regardless, the queen of the underworld finds Asushinami just like incredibly hot. So Asushinami turns on their riz and is like, hey, baby girl, why don't you show me that water of life? That sounds terrible, I know. And Ereshkigal is like, anything for you, attractive person, and gets the water of life for Asushinami. Asushinami sprinkles the water on Ishtar and she recovers to full HP. Wow. So Ishtar and Asushinami just start booking it out of the underworld. This makes Ereshkigal very mad because her boy toy twink male wife is getting away. I forgot upon writing that I was going to have to read that out loud. So she curses Asushinami and everyone like them to be ostracized from society forever. Oh no. They reach the surface and Ishtar is like, dang, that sucks. Here, you can do magic now and prophecy stuff. Hope that helps. And so people who didn't fit neatly into their assigned gender roles were actually the priests of Ishtar and were sacred. Right? I just think that's cool. Okay. Next story is a lot shorter. It's from Shintoism, which is the main religion in Japan. And the story follows Amaterasu, who was the goddess of the sun, and her annoying younger brother, the storm god, Susanoo. So our story starts with Susanoo being kicked out of heaven when Izanagi, he's an underworld dude, don't worry about it, I won't talk about him later, but I can tell you about him later if you want. Izanagi orders Susanoo to go check on the underworld. So Susanoo isn't too happy about being told to literally go to hell, so instead he decides to check on his sister. Now the problem here is that Susanoo has a bit of a reputation for causing trouble, so Amaterasu doesn't trust him. As a show of good faith, Susanoo suggests a friendly god-making competition. Sadly, the rules of the competition weren't laid out clearly, so after both of them made 8 gods, they both proudly declared themselves the winner. During this legendary battle that they had afterward, it was like, rah, 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 they were fighting. Susanoo throws a flayed pony. Now, if you don't know what a flayed pony is, don't Google it. Don't. He throws that into Amaterasu's weaving hall. So the shock of this horrendous violation of hospitality laws causes one of Amaterasu's servants to just drop dead on the spot. R.I.P., random unnamed servant, you will be missed. Let's pour one out for the homies. Amaterasu gets very mad, and she goes off to sulk in a cave, as we all want to on occasion. Now, this is bad for everyone, because without Amaterasu's sunlight, things start to wither and die, and demons leak out of the underworld. So the gods gather together and try to make a plan to get Amaterasu to wake up. Their first idea is to dump out a bunch of roosters and hope that the crow of the rooster will make her leave the cave. Predictably, this plan fails, and they probably fire whatever idiot came up with it. He's probably not a god anymore. Their next plan, a little bit more inspired, I guess. So they set up this mirror, and so when she comes out of the cave, she'll see her reflection. It's not extremely clear why they thought this would be helpful. And then one of the gods, who actually knows what they are doing, goes off to get the goddess Ame no Uzumi. She's the goddess of the dawn and parties and other fun things, and suggests that she lures out Amaterasu by stripping. If I had a nickel for every mythological story I'm telling you about that involves a goddess stripping, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot. It's weird that it happened twice. I did that on purpose so I can make that joke, you see. Now, as the goddess of fun and partying, Ame no Uzumi is more than happy to get naked if it means saving the world, and probably even if it didn't. So Amaterasu hears the commotion outside and pops her head out. And she sees the roosters, she sees the mirror, and then she sees the enthusiastic naked woman, and she gets out of the cave. Feel free to read into that however you want. So the other gods then, push a rock in front of that cave, so she can never do that again. And Susanoo goes off, he does some hijinks, he's kicked out of heaven for a while. Oh boy. Now we're on to the long story. This one isn't a story, as much as it is me showing you how much research I did for this. Okay. Dionysus. I know what you're thinking? Malachi? I already know everything about Dionysus. There's not that much. He's the god of wine, life of the party, known primarily for being drunk and having some pretty intense fangirls who killed Orpheus that one time. He spends most of his day draped in grapes and turning dudes into dolphins. Is there really that more to him? The answer to that question is yes. Because if it wasn't, this section would be 5 minutes, and then I'd be done. But we'll get to that eventually. First, we're going to speedrun his background. So Dionysus' story begins with Zeus, who at this point is less the god of thunder and more the god of one-night stands, carrying on a semi-secret affair with the mortal woman Semele. Hera catches wind of this, and for some reason decides that she's tired of just outright killing Zeus's children and girlfriends, and for this particular murder, she's going to mix it up with some disguises. Hera transforms into an old woman and tricks Semele into thinking Zeus might not actually be who he says he is. So the next time they meet up, Semele makes Zeus promise her a favor, then demands he drop the mortal shape and reveal himself in all his glory. And Zeus does that, and she gets vaporized, because, he's a god. Good news, the mom is dead, but the baby lives. Zeus takes little demigod baby Dionysus and sews him into his legs, so the kid can finish growing. A few months later, Dionysus is born for realsies, and his exploits can finally get started. Keep an eye on that initial theme of rebirth. It's central to some very interesting aspects of his character I'll explore later. But first, shenanigans. Dionysus is, of course, wildly unsafe on Olympus on account of Hera, so Zeus sends him away to be raised in secret. Exactly who raises him varies from telling to telling, with foster parents ranging from Hermes, Rhea, the mortal king Athamas, and Queen Ino, who raised him as a girl, and even Persephone. Let's also make note of his connection to Persephone in this version. This will all come together perfectly later, I promise. So Dionysus grows up to young adulthood and begins his classic godly exploits. He learns how to make wine. Hera drives him crazy temporarily before Rhea fixes that. Then he gets on to teaching the world about wine. There's a story that Alexander the Pretty Alright stumbled on a town called Nyssa during his journeys along the Indus River, which they told him was founded by Dionysus during his meanderings. And Dionysus is also apparently a snack, which occasionally gets him in trouble when he gets abducted by sailors for unsavory purposes. Of course, they get more than they bargained for, and Dionysus responds by turning the mast and oars into snakes, filling the ship with ivy and the sound of flutes, and maybe turning into a lion? It's unclear, depending on the translation, whether or not that actually happened. This obviously terrifies or drives the sailors mad, and they leap overboard. And then they're turned into dolphins. You may be wondering, hey, how did the cheerfully drunk god of wine do all that stuff you said? What does feral wildlife and crippling insanity have to do with a fine Chardonnay? Don't worry about it. So now that we've established some canon for Dionysus, forget literally all of that. There is no canon. Canon is something that was made up. There's only an endlessly deep well of mysteries and fragmented mythology, and Dionysus is much, much older and weirder than he seems. I know you asked for a mythology lesson. Too bad you're getting a history lesson now. So ancient Greece, as we generally conceive of it, got going around 700 BC. Before that, the civilization in the area was the Mycenaean Greece, which existed between 1600 and 1100 BC. After it fell apart in the late Bronze Age, which collapsed, there was a few centuries of Dark Ages where nothing really got written down. And then city-states started popping up, and Greece got its act together over the course of a couple hundred years, starting around 900 BC. Now, Mycenaean Greece and ancient Greece had a pretty interesting dynamic, since although they were, practically speaking, different cultures, ancient Greece seems to have thought of itself as a successor to Mycenaean Greece. Classics like the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in the 700s BC, but explicitly set in the legendary past of Mycenaean Greece. There was also a linguistic rollover. Mycenaean is considered an early form of Greek, but was written in Linear B, a syllabic script, which was replaced around 900 BC. Anyway, this is important because the majority of the Hellenistic pantheon originated in Mycenaean Greece, and we know this because we found their names in Linear B inscriptions. Dionysus is one of those gods. In most cases, we know very little about what roles they played in the Mycenaean religion, although they seem very different from their classical Hellenized characterizations. Poseidon, for example, seems to have fulfilled the role of head god. He was treated more as a god of earthquakes than a god of the sea. We do know that Mycenaean religion seems to have put a stronger focus, compared to Hellenism, did on worshipping chthonic deities. Chthonic just means anything related to the underworld, so think like Hades, Persephone. And that Poseidon's Earthshaker epithet, that designated him as a chthonic god, and might have been why he was considered so important, while Zeus, in contrast, as a sky god, was barely acknowledged. There's also, fun fact, no Mycenaean equivalent to Hades, although Persephone and Demeter are both Mycenaean in origin. Anyway, regardless of who they used to be, by the time ancient Greece as we think of it got going, and we really started getting written records again, all those old Mycenaean gods were pretty solidly locked into their new Hellenized characterizations. Poseidon got nerfed and sidelined and had his chthonic connections minimized. Chthonic gods in general were shunted to the background. Sky god Zeus got to be the most important dude on the block, and everybody adjusted pretty quickly. Everyone except for Dionysus. See, here's the thing. In the early days of ancient Greek historical analysis, everybody knew that Dionysus was a latecomer to the pantheon, though exactly how late is hard to pin down. But nobody really knew why. Before Linear B was deciphered, the theory was that he was an import god, since there were a lot of his documented myths had him coming from Greece, from somewhere else, or wandering far afield before returning. But after finding his name in Mycenaean Greek inscriptions, that theory went out the window and a replacement was proposed. That Dionysian worship predated ancient Greece and was deliberately suppressed for several hundred years before undergoing modification and being allowed into the Hellenistic pantheon. Since ancient Greece had kind of a known habit of not exactly promoting equality for all its citizens, this wasn't too crazy of a notion. In essence, what distinguishes Dionysus from the rest of his pantheon is that his character development didn't happen during the Greek Dark Ages, but several centuries after everyone else got with the program, which is actually pretty appropriate for a guy whose most consistent character trait at this point in history was chronic drunk. But why was he so late to transition? Well, to understand that, we have to understand his cult. And to understand his cult, we have to understand who Dionysus was before he got Hellenized. So let's talk about that. First of all, we need to define some names. Dionysus is usually the name used for the Hellenistic characterization we've already established. Orphic Dionysus is the scarier, older version, embraced by the religion of Orphism, a characterization that puts the focus more on themes of death and rebirth. These two have notably different backstories. Confusing matters, Orphic Dionysus has been equated with another figure called Zagreus. It's unclear whether this was a later syncretism or an early case of multiple names for one god. Orphism, side note, was a 6th century BC religion that basically boiled down to an attempt to understand life and death. Mostly worshipped gods or figures that had entered the underworld and left alive, like Orpheus, hence the name Orphic. Other noteworthy figures of worship included Persephone, for fairly obvious reasons, but working from this definition, it's unclear why Dionysus would have caught the attention of a cult focused on death and rebirth, when it seems like the farthest we can stretch his characterization at this point is drunk and rowdy. What connection did Dionysus have with the underworld that would cause an Orphic cult to favor him? Let's talk about an older version of Dionysus' birth. The first difference between Orphic Dionysus and plain vanilla Dionysus is that he's the son of Zeus and Persephone, while in older fragmentary myths, Zagreus is instead the son of Hades and Persephone. Whichever way the parentage swings, Orphic Dionysus is stated to inherit Zeus' status as king of the gods, which enrages Hera, who gets a bunch of titans to murder baby Orphic Dionysus by ripping him apart and eating him. Athena saves his heart, and with Zeus' help, gets him reborn, either by doing the leg implant thing again, or by sticking the heart in Semele so she can grow a baby around it. Either way, Orphic Dionysus gets reborn after being ritualistically shredded and gets on with the whole being a god thing. This myth predates his Semele parentage and possibly predates ancient Greece overall, since the Mycenaean characterization also featured this theme of dying and being reborn early in life. It handily contextualizes both his theme of rebirth and his weird connection with Persephone that we touched on earlier, as well as giving him an unexpected link with the underworld that we don't see much of in his later characterization. This is strengthened by his Zagreus epithet. Zagreus in his earliest references isn't explicitly connected with Dionysus, but he is strongly linked with Hades in the underworld in general. In his earliest references from about the 600s BC, it's not even clear if he and Hades are different entities, and he's hugely important in the underworld hierarchy. Zagreus as a standalone entity seems to have been a very important chthonic god, and by appending his name to Dionysus, Dionysus inherits his strong underworld connections. Going back as far as we can, the Mycenaean inscriptions confirm that Dionysus' death and rebirth, as well as his status as the son of Zeus, were original elements of his characterization, not later additions by his Orphic cult. He's also got some themes of being abandoned by humanity and raised in nature, which might play into his later nature and animalistic associations. So this gives us something of a starting point. Dionysus entered the ancient Greek world as a god of death and rebirth with strong connections to the underworld. Sorry, I didn't expect to talk this much. Those underworld connections appeal to the later Orphic religious movement, causing his characterization to get a bit schizophrenic as they put focus on an element of his characterization, otherwise largely left behind. Anyway, this alternative birth myth gives us something of a feel for where his characterization started, but doesn't really explain why he would have been excluded from the Hellenistic pantheon. We also haven't put together where his wine connection came from yet. So now let's talk about what his personal cult can tell us about the rest of his characterization. The cult of Dionysus was, unfortunately for us, a mystery cult, meaning its exact rituals and practices were kept secret from outsiders. But we have pieced together the basics. For one thing, it predates ancient Greece by a wide margin, and might even predate Mycenaean Greece in one form or another. It also most likely started off as less of a Dionysus cult and more of a wine cult, worshipping the state of intoxication and the liberation from societal inhibitions that came with it. Because wine predates Mycenaean Greece and consequently Dionysus, and the wine cult is very focused on wine and the effects thereof, with the Dionysian aspect almost seeming secondary, it's even possible that the wine cult originated around the same time wine did, aka 6000 BC, making it very old. If this is true, it also probably originated in this place called the Zagros Mountain, which, yes, does sound a lot like Zagreus, but this would be a really convenient etymological link if the two words were actually connected. Sadly, they are not, but still a neat coincidence. Anyway, if this theory holds, the cult probably followed wine export routes to wind up in Egypt, and then Minoan Crete, and then Mycenaean Greece, where it scooped up Dionysus and made him its own. Really, for our purposes, it doesn't matter where or when the wine cult started, just that it wound up in Mycenaean Greece one way or another. The short of it is, a wine-centric cult popped up in the area, and one way or another, Mycenaean Dionysus got wrapped up into it, turning it into a localized Dionysian cult and potentially affecting its early Mycenaean characterization to incorporate the invention of wine in the first place. We don't really know, though, since the records are limited, and to a certain extent we're playing around in the recordless Dark Ages, but it would make sense. So by the time the Dark Ages wrapped up and the cult of Dionysus was firmly established and centered on the Dionysian mysteries, which was this ritual that predominantly focused on getting crazy stupid high, Whoa Dionysus, the 70s called, they want to know if they can borrow some of your stash. I forget that I have to read these things out loud. Intoxication was, at this point, considered a form of possession by Dionysus' spirit, which in turn allowed the cult members to theoretically tap into his divine power, along with the primordial inhibition in the subconscious mind that Dionysus' madness could release. There was also some pretty hefty symbolism linking the transformation of living grapes into fermented wine with Dionysus' transformative rebirth. Anyway, the whole point was liberation, catharsis, and a connection to the divine, as well as drunken insanity, crazy music and dancing, and symbolic recreations of Dionysus' death and rebirth. A lot of dismemberment happened, like a lot. Mostly to bulls because they were symbolic of Dionysus, but it also happened to other stuff. Ever wonder why Orpheus got ripped apart by those ladies that one time? It's this. He died for a sweet literary reference. He was an artist. That's what he would have wanted. Unsurprisingly, Dionysus' cult attracted a lot of marginalized people, like women, slaves, and non-citizens, because it gave them the opportunity to reject the societal constraints getting dumped on them. Double unsurprisingly, this cult wasn't very popular with the society that made those constraints, which led to several centuries worth of attempts from various Greek governments to outlaw the cult together, which never ever worked because wine and parties and sticking it to the man will never die. So after this had failed enough times, eventually Greece settled on trying to control it a little bit, resulting in the establishment and gradual acceptance of the more chilled out Hellenistic Dionysus we all know and love. It's tricky to put dates to this sort of deific character revolution, but we've got a few concrete milestones to work from. To start with, Dionysus is explicitly not in the Olympic pantheon during the 8th century BC, because that's when the Iliad and the Odyssey were written, and Dionysus is notably nowhere to be found. He and Hestia are the only ones of the traditional 12 Olympians to not be referenced, So this is a noteworthy exclusion. Dionysus was officially integrated into Athens somewhere between 561 and 527 BC, because that's the duration of the reign of the famous tyrant I'm going to mess this one up. Pisistratus imported it to Athens and agreed to incorporate a competition of performances and plays, which eventually produced the field of Greek theater overall. At this point, however, one gets the impression that Dionysus still wasn't fully popular with the Athenians, as Pisistratus justified the importance of the Dionysia with a myth that outlined all the horrifying things Dionysus could and would do to the dongs of the Athenians who rejected him. This is not a joke, and is why the Dionysia would feature a parade of people carrying sculpted junk. Contemporary imagery of Dionysus also usually recalled an older visual where he sported a beard and an overall mature look. So at this point, Dionysus has landed in Athens, but hasn't fully transitioned to his popular young drunk hippie characterization yet. The next milestone comes to us from Euripides, who provides us with a literary missing link in the form of the Bache. First performed in 405 BC at the Dionysia festival, the Bache showed us the Dionysus in roughly the middle of his transition from terrifying god of uninhibited madness to a party guy. As he returns to Greece from a globe-trotting exile with an army of Maenads to claim his divine status and take revenge on a king who outlawed his worship, this Dionysus is the child of Zeus and Semele, born prematurely, roughly in accordance with the Hellenistic version we discussed earlier. But in this case, the people of Thebes refuse to believe his divine origins, so he drives them crazy and claims them as his followers. After a sufficiently large number of shenanigans involving natural disasters and plagues of madness, Dionysus begins to warp King Pentheus' sanity, who begins to see through Dionysus' mortal disguise and notices that he has horns. Another holdover from the older, scarier characterization that didn't make it to the Hellenized edition. King Pentheus winds up getting dismembered by Dionysus' Maenads, including some of Pentheus' female relatives, and it's a happy ending, at least a cathartic one. This mid-transition Dionysian characterization shows us a Dionysus with a mortal mother, no explicit death and rebirth, a serious temper, no regard for the social structures that reject him, an army of crazed followers, the ability to induce madness and hallucinations in whoever he wants, and horns. Despite the absence of his dismemberment and rebirth in his Bache backstory, the theme has still held on in his worship, which is why Pentheus is dismembered in such a familiar way. Despite lacking the immediate mythical context, it also shows us that 400 BC Dionysus was basically considered an Olympian, even if his characterization wasn't quite all happy, fun, drunk just yet. But even though Dionysus has attained a level of chill deemed acceptable by polite Athenian society, he's not really recognizable as the party dude we all know and love. He's getting there, but he's not there yet. So what's next? A century after Euripides, a little something happened to Greece called Alexander the Great gets up in everyone's business. During which time, Alexander the All-Right conquered his way through Persia, the Levant, and Egypt, radically expanding the ancient Greek world and paving the way for centuries of luxury for kings that ruled this expanded Hellenistic world. These kings focused on two things, and two things only: power and parties. And wouldn't you know it, there is an Olympian all set and ready to embody both of those things. Post the 300s BC, Dionysus' popularity exploded as the ruling class began embracing his extravagance and unrestrained party vibe. With the convenient undertone that Dionysus had been characterized as a conqueror for the past couple centuries, leading these kings to embrace his image even more strongly. Some of them even acted like they were Dionysus, but incarnated or something. A cult that had previously belonged largely to marginalized communities that threatened the ruling class was suddenly being embraced by that ruling class because, frankly, the cult of Dionysus threw the best parties. Well, with all the wealth and power they had to throw around, the Hellenistic kings didn't really want to do anything but party. With that, Dionysus completes his transformation from death god to party animal. Thanks to the nationalization of his cult during the Hellenistic period, Dionysus, or Bacchus, as he was commonly called at this point, settled into his recognizable modern-day characterization, leaving the majority of his more alarming character traits behind. But this goes a long way toward explaining the lingering idiosyncrasies in his characters. Dionysus probably had one of the most radical transformations in the entire pantheon, and while the toned-down, recognizable version was mostly chill, he never completely lost the old-school death and madness god he used to be worshipped as. To torture a metaphor, both Dionysus and Greek wine were watered down for potability. But that didn't make them lose their inherent intoxicating properties. This also goes a long way to explaining why a pantheon of gods with concepts as big as war and wisdom in the entire ocean would bother having a god on the prayer roll, whose entire job was being drunk. Wowza. That was a long one. I had to pause the recording there to take a drink of water. So now we're on to a lot shorter one. This one is about Maui, like the guy from the Disney movie Moana. Yeah. But our story starts with Hine Nui Tepor. She's the daughter of Tani Mahata, who's the god of the forest. But he also took her as his wife. Sweet home Alabama, as you know. When she discovered that her husband was in fact her father, Hine Nui Tepo fled to the underworld in shame, where she then became its ruler. Now on to Maui. Despite his many achievements, which included slowing the course of the sun so that light lasted all day, and all the other things he did in that one song by Lin-Manuel Miranda, he lived in the knowledge that he would one day die, following an omen cast over him by his father on the day of his baptism. Not to be stopped by such trivialities, Maui resolved to visit Hinenui Tepor and trick her into granting him immortality. Ahead of his visit, Maui did the only logical thing he could do, and gathered a flock of different birds to take with him. This, of course, was a great idea, with zero flaws. He then made his way to the goddess, whose hair resembled seaweed, her mouth a barracuda, and she had eyes of bright red stone. Not the thing from Minecraft. When Maui and his feathered friends reached her, she was asleep on her back with her legs wide open, in between which they could see sharp shards of volcanic glass and rock. In case it wasn't clear, in Maori mythology, the entrance to the underworld is Hinenui Tepo's vagina. Yeah, that's fun. Prefer it to be a cave. Anyway, Maui removed his clothes for some reason and entered in between Hinenui Tepo's legs with his entire body. In case it wasn't clear, she's like really big. Although he had asked his avian friends not to laugh until he exited through the goddess's mouth, it's apparently too much for one of them, and the bird began to laugh. This awoke Hinenui Tepo immediately, and she crushed Maui with her razor-sharp vagina, and he became the first living thing to die. It is because of this that all Maori people must experience death. And Disney is a coward for not including this in the movie. Right, so next is the short fun facts section. That's just a couple of short fun facts. There are supposed to be more sections to this, but then I wrote 3,500 words on Dionysus. So you get short fun facts. I'm not going to read this because my vocal cords are exhausted from reading 3,500 words on Dionysus. Thank you if you listened to all of this, because it probably sounded terrible with how often I messed up. Regardless, thank you, and Merry Christmas.